May be seated. Good afternoon, colleagues, comrades, brothers and sisters. The Burnham Foundation welcomes you to this another symposium of the Foundation. On this occasion, a symposium which is dedicated to a matter of national importance. That is the controversy on the question of the Guyana Venezuela border and the actions being undertaken at this point in time by the Venezuelans in pursuit of their ambition to integrate Essequibo into Venezuela. The Burnham Foundation is an organization which has been established for the purpose of memorializing and commemorating the life and work of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham. And so one may well pose the problem: what's the relationship between the intention of the foundation, the goals of the foundation, and a symposium of this nature? In what manner are we today commemorating and memorializing Burnham? The foundation recognizes that one of the strengths of Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham was public education. And we are of the view that at this point in time, public education on the border controversy is more important and more relevant than ever before. And therefore, in that context, we are continuing the work of the founder and commemorating and memorializing him. We're also conscious of the fact that Burnham played a significant role, if not the pivotal role, from the time Guyana attained independence up to the time of his demise, in ensuring that the territorial integrity of Guyana was protected and maintained, and that the ideas which he embraced are still relevant even today as we seek to ensure that the integrity, our territorial integrity, and our sovereignty is maintained. The foundation therefore finds it necessary to engage in this activity at this time. And therefore today we are going to bring to you three presenters on the subject at hand, with the intention of giving you a historical perspective of how this whole issue came about, how in fact we even arrived at the arbitral award, and where we're at and how we need to move forward as a united Guyana on this question. And so we'll bring to you some presenters, after which there'll be an opportunity for you to make comments, pose questions, and have those questions answered if the answers are available. We hope to leave here this evening with some resolve about what we think should be the way forward for Guyana on this issue of the border controversy and Venezuela's aggression and disposition in relation to a controversy which they initiated on the eve of Guyana's independence. I would therefore not like to stand between you and our presenters. There are three presenters this evening. Mr. Dwayne Benjamin, a lecturer at the University of Guyana, a young academic whose field of study is history, and therefore one would expect that he would bring the historical perspective in his presentation. We also have Dr. Mark Curtin, himself a former lecturer at the University of Guyana, a former lecturer at the University of the West Indies, and one who's an expert on Latin American affairs. And this matter we are discussing today is located squarely in the Latin America arena, and a matter that can be considered a Latin American affair. So Dr. Mark Curtin will find this his stomping ground as he brings to us his perspective on the geopolitical aspect of the controversy which we are addressing. We also have retired Admiral of the Guyana Defense Force, Rear Admiral, thank you. There's some bright person there in the audience. Retired Rear Admiral of the Guyana Defense Force, who has equipped himself not only from the standpoint of being the Rear Admiral and therefore knowledgeable on matters of defense, but who has dedicated himself to studies, global studies, and in that regard will bring to bear his knowledge as he speaks from the standpoint of defense and global studies, and I dare say probably defense diplomacy. Those are our presenters today. I have not in any way attempted to bring the entire CVs of these gentlemen to you. I think they are well known and in recent times have been in the vanguard of addressing this subject matter. And so I will ask them to present in the order of which I introduce them without me intervening between them and the presentation. So once the presentations start, they will simply roll from one to the other until the presentations are concluded. And then, as your moderator for today, yours truly, Vincent Alexander, Chairman of the Burnham Foundation, I will resume my role to continue today's symposium. So I welcome the forum. I welcome to this podium Mr. Dwayne Benjamin, lecturer, University of Guyana, who specializes in the area of history. Dwayne Benjamin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander, Chairman of the Burnham Foundation. A pleasant good afternoon to you all in the audience. The title of my presentation is The Historical Antecedents to the 1899 Tribunal. What I'm seeking to do is revisit the historical journey leading to the 1899 Paris Tribunal Award that has effectively settled the borders between Guyana and Venezuela. As history records that it was on the 3rd day of October, 1899, that the Paris Tribunal delivered a landmark judgment that allowed for the current demarcation of boundaries between the two states. Now, how did we arrive here? How did we arrive at the 1899 Tribunal? To understand the current, or rather to understand our journey to the 1899 Tribunal, it is important for us to revisit the historical evolution of the border controversy between Guyana and Venezuela. The genesis of the current controversy between Guyana and Venezuela and the question of territorial claims to Essequibo can be traced deep to the colonial history of both states. As history records, in 1498, Christopher Columbus, an Italian sailor, explorer operating under the Spanish flag and with the blessings of the Spanish monarchs, sailed in a southerly route, passed along the coast of the Guyanas, known as the Wild Coast, that we know today as the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, through the Gulf of Paria between Venezuela and Trinidad to the island of Margarita and also to Caracas, before striking a northwestward journey to his base in Hispaniola. Columbus initially did not stop or settle or even attempt to explore the land area that is known as Essequibo, or for that matter, the entire Guyana as we know it today. In fact, his journey took him to Venezuela. But Columbus was followed by other explorers such as Alonso de Ojeda, who was with him on his second voyage and who explored the Venezuelan coast in the name of Spain. Ojeda's expedition explored the mouths of the Orinoco River up to the Gulf of Mexico and Curacao. And the expedition was followed by another Spanish explorer, Vincent Pinzon, who sailed further up the Arzon River and also explored the mouths of the Orinoco. These expeditions were integral in the subsequent Spanish claim to Venezuela and by extension the entire New World by virtue of two important developments that took place immediately after the beginning of Spanish exploration in the New World. The first being the Inter Caetera, the Papal Bull of 1493 that was ratified by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, in which the world was divided into an imaginary line was drawn across the Atlantic, dividing between two rival Catholic nations, Portugal on one hand that got access to West Africa, and Spain, on the other hand, that got access to all lands that were discovered in the New World. So that this basically was the basis for Spain having an exclusive monopoly of the New World and having a claim to land in the New World. However, it is my contention that having a claim and effective occupation are two mutually exclusive issues. And in terms of effective occupation, the first historical evidence of Spanish occupation of Venezuela, Orinoco, was in the year 1595 when a Spanish explorer by the name of Antonio de Barrio founded a settlement at Santo Tome de la Guayana, which is 140 miles up the Orinoco on the western bank. The establishment of this town coincided with the officially recorded English and Dutch exploration of the Guyana coast in the persons of Sir Walter Raleigh in 1597 and Dutch explorer Cabello in 1597-1598. And this was significant because what it did, it marked the beginning of the Dutch occupation in an area that was not occupied or relatively unknown to Spaniards and other Europeans. However, there's still some questions about the actual arrival of the Dutch, because what is known for certain is that by the end of the 16th century, there was some evidence of Dutch settlements in the Pomeroon, in Cuyuni, Mazaruni, in the Waini, and on the right bank of the Orinoco River. These were not permanent settlements, but rather trading posts that were built to facilitate trade with indigenous people. Official sources provided by Dr. Nigel Gravesandi in his thesis entitled The Question of Spanish and Dutch Occupation in the Venezuela-Guyana Boundary Dispute noted an official report to the King of Spain in 1596 by one Don Roque de Montes, who was the royal treasurer commoner deep in the Orinoco in Venezuela, in which he suggested that Spain should, as a matter of necessity, settle the three provinces of Guyana, Quara, and El Dorado. Interestingly enough, these three places mentioned were all on the right bank of the Orinoco River, which is on, back then, what was known as the Guyana side of the Dutch side of the Orinoco. Gravesandi further contended that by deed the Spaniards seems to have fair knowledge of Dutch presence in the Guyanas, as well as a location of their own settlement by the end of the 16th century. And quoting a secret report describing settlements of the Spanish in the Americas, the Dutch, and I quote, he says, the Dutch settlements in Guyana extend from close to the river Amazon to the Orinoco. And the best settlement they possess in the whole of the coast is that of Nova Zelandia in the Pomeroon River, very near to the Orinoco and close to the city of Santo Tome de la Guayana, which belongs to your Majesty. And this was basically a Spanish report of someone reporting to the King of Spain. What is interesting here is that the early 16th century was a period of discovery and settlement. And in the 17th century, saw efforts to consolidate Dutch control of the Essequibo colony with the establishment of the first permanent settlement at Kaikoveral in the year 1616 at the junction of the Cuyuni and Mazaruni River. In fact, Kaikoveral became the administrative center of the Dutch colonial administration in the colony of Essequibo up until 1718, when it was moved to the river bank, and 20 years later to the mouth of Essequibo at what is known today as Fort Island. Some historians have argued that the motivations for the locations were security, defense, as well as trade with the indigenous populations. And it was during the 17th century that the Dutch West India Company, a key institution, was formed to promote Dutch trade and colonization. As part of its mandate, the company oversaw the security and defense of Dutch colonies, as well as the establishment of Dutch settlement. The Dutch West India Company was integral in the establishment of trading posts and settlements later in Maruca, Cuyuni, Mazaruni, as well as the upper Essequibo at Arinda, to trade with indigenous Indians for dyes, boats, foodstuff, and others. The company also planted coffee and indigo on plantations in the Cuyuni, and also gave permission to private individuals to establish plantations in the upper and lower Mazaruni of the Essequibo. Now, these actions are very significant because what it does, it established Dutch sovereignty over the Essequibo, and like I said earlier, it's one thing to claim ownership, but effective occupation is another. So this is where we see the actions of early Dutch colonizers essentially establishing sovereignty, establishing ownership, and control of the Essequibo area. In 1648, the Treaty of Munster was signed with each nation recognizing the territorial rights, each European nation recognizing territorial rights in the New World. The Treaty of Munster was part of the Peace Treaty of Westphalia in 1848 at the end of the 30-year war between the Habsburg Empire and France and its allies. What is important to note is that both Netherlands and Spain formally recognized each other's right of existence in the area that is known as Guyana. However, no formal settlement at that time was made to solve the border question, and at no point was it raised at this point. The late 17th century saw little effort of consolidation in the past of the Spaniards in the area on the question, as one historian noted that by the early 18th century, Santo Tomé remained the only Spanish settlement outside of the area in question, and this settlement was described as miserable and stood in stark contrast to the Dutch settlements in Peru, in Pomerania and Maruca region. In fact, as early as 1661, the planters in Pomerania had been requesting sugar boilers, slaves, and others from the Dutch West India Company. Further, the population of the settlement has been given as 600 Dutch and indigenous, as well as 1,000 enslaved Africans. So that both Pomerania and Maruca, by virtue of their development, have been attracting immigrants rapidly and developing at the true potential. While on the other side of the Orinoco River, Santo Tomé de la Guayana remained underdeveloped, and as some historians argue, that it was basically neglected by the Venezuelans. Now, this is very important because, again, it shows that by the beginning of the 18th century also, the Spaniards had little interest or little attempt to establish settlements in Essequibo. However, in the 18th century, all of this would have changed. And the 18th century was a period of attempted expansion in the South Orinoco and further into the Essequibo by the Spaniards. For the first time, Spaniards' incursion into Dutch territory were recorded. Incursions were led mainly by missionaries operating deep in the Orinoco and were gradually extended close to the south bank of the Orinoco on the Dutch side of the Orinoco. Additionally, there were sporadic conflicts between the Dutch and the Spanish in Essequibo, culminated in one instance in the destruction of the Dutch post on the Cuyuni River in 1758. 11 years later, Spanish military incursions also proceeded with the seizure of Maruca in 1769 and attempts at settlements in Burnham and Waini areas. These actions by the Spaniards did not go unnoticed by the Dutch commander of Essequibo, Dutch commandor of Essequibo, Lawrence Thorn van Gravesande, who wasted no time in voicing his opposition and displeasure to the Spanish incursion. As history records that it was Gravesande who was integral in consolidating the colonies of Essequibo and Demoir, but more importantly, he was very resolute in protecting the colonies against the Spanish aggression, because in his words, he sees this as a foundation on which he can consolidate the colonies, albeit with little or no support from the Dutch administration in Netherlands. In fact, it was Gravesande who in 1759 called for the establishment of a boundary line between Essequibo and Orinoco. And in fact, he reached out to the Spanish government, but in the face of inaction, the Dutch issued a declaration claiming not only Essequibo, but the rivers and creeks on the coast that flowed into the Atlantic Ocean. And this is the first definitive statement on the question of the boundaries between Guyana and Essequibo. In 1781, English seized Dutch settlements as retribution for Holland joining Russia, Sweden, and Denmark in an armed neutrality agreement during the American War of Independence. And the interesting thing about the 18th century is you can see a concerted pattern by both the Spaniards as well as the Dutch to claim Essequibo. So that during the late 18th century, where there were several global upheavals that affected the efforts at finding a solution to the border problem. And I'm going to outline some of these. In 1781, the English seized Dutch settlements as a retribution for Holland joining Russia, Sweden, and Denmark in an armed neutrality agreement during the American War of Independence. In 1782, the French recaptured the colony and restored them to the Dutch in 1784. In 1796, the English seized all Dutch settlements in the Guyana after the Netherlands was transformed into the Batavian Republic with Napoleonic France. By virtue of the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, the colonies were returned to Dutch, by now the Batavian Republic, and that, again, the Dutch attempted to settle the boundary question. But this was thwarted by Britain, who objected to the proposed Burnham River boundaries, or proposed Burnham River as the boundary between the two nations. In fact, one of the things about Britain is that by the time the signing of the treaty in 1802, Britain would have already had considerable influence and considerable also business interests as well as population in the colonies. In 1803, war broke out in Europe and the English recaptured the Dutch settlements. And 1814, these settlements were formally ceded to Britain by virtue of the Treaty of London. And by that, it meant that the Dutch gave up absolute control of the colonies, and Britain became the new colonial masters. By the early 19th century, in fact, the 19th century saw a concerted effort to settle the question following two significant developments. One, the separation of Venezuela from Grand Colombia and the formal recognition of Venezuelan independence in 1845 by Spain. Now, in all of this, Venezuela declared that the eastern boundary of that nation was the Essequibo River. And interestingly, the Essequibo River was proposed to be the boundary point. Britain did not immediately respond to the Venezuelan declaration for numerous reasons, including the fact that Britain had their own domestic turmoil taking place at the time. But instead, authorized Prussian naturalist Robert Schomburg to explore the region and to seek out a convenient boundary between the two countries. In 1840, Schomburg proposed Point Barima as the eastern boundary between Venezuela and Guyana. Schomburg's proposal was rejected by the Venezuelans, and the two countries adopted a strategy of using diplomacy to settle the boundary question. In 1844, Venezuela proposed a claim up to the Essequibo River, but reneged on the assumption that Britain would not agree to give up settlements in the Pomeroon and Americo River. In fact, it was estimated that by that time, Britain had in excess of 40,000 citizens residing in that area. So Venezuela had shown an inclination to acceptance of Maruca as the Maruca River, as the boundary. In 1845, the two countries signed a status quo declaration that each country agreed not to occupy the disputed territory. However, this declaration was short-lived, as by 1850s, gold deposits in large quantities was found in Urari as well as Cuyuni area, and subsequently in the Mazarin and elsewhere. In fact, by 1867, British Guyana Mining Company was authorized to mine the Cuyuni area. And at that point, the controversy became even more, it rise again. And the response of Venezuela was to enlist U.S. support. The Americans was a bit reluctant initially to get involved. In 1871, Lord Salisbury, British Foreign Secretary, made a broad claim to the disputed territory in which he proposed Burnham at the mouth of the Orinoco as the boundary. And this was subsequently followed by the presence of British gunboats in the Orinoco River. And this emboldened Venezuela not only to reject and resent the British proposal, but also appeal to the United States on the grounds of the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine is a doctrine adopted by the United States in 1823, which says that any European power that intervenes in this Western Hemisphere is an act of declaration of war in the United States. It's tantamount to aggression in the United States. So it was on that basis that the Venezuelans was able to convince the United States to enter into the controversy in support of their cause. And it was pressure from the United States that Britain agreed to refer the dispute to international arbitration by way of a Treaty of Washington in 1897. And this is what laid the foundation for the 1899 tribunal. And this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'll hand over to my learned colleagues.
Good evening, colleagues all. Just to, and thank you very much to the Burnham Foundation for its kind invitation for me to participate in this most important activity. I listened to my colleague, and I wouldn't bore you with the details, but just to ensure that we get the context, by 1899, with strong Anglo-American rivalry and the American argument of its sphere of influence, there was the 1897 Treaty of Washington and the 1899 Paris Award, the Arbitral Award, which, in a sense, as my colleague mentioned, the award gave the Orinoco River to Venezuela. And you know, the 1899 Arbitral Award was seen as full, final, and perfect. And it was almost 6 decades later when a posthumous letter was produced by Venezuela arguing that there was collusion and that the claim and that the award was invalid. And I think it's important upfront to note that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is being asked only to look at the validity of the claim of it being null and void. In other words, there's this concern that they could cut up the boundaries and provide Venezuela with any new land. Now, the ICJ has been asked to adjudicate on a matter, and the matter is the validity of the claim of nullity. I've been asked to look at the geopolitical context, and one here looks at, by 1905, after the award, we see Venezuela and British Guyana in that geopolitical context, agreeing that that was the boundary. By 1931, Guyana, British Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil established what is known as a tri-junction point, in which the boundaries of Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil met. And there was full agreement in that, and I think one has to look at in the context of the Brazilian participation. Brazil has always and continues to support the sanctity or the inviolability of borders which have been settled by judicial agreement. And I think that's also important to note in the context of Brazil's engagement, which I think we should talk about a bit later. So we look at what has happened, and I've been asked to look at the geopolitical element this afternoon. But as we look at the emergence of the controversy, we understand that the first phase, which was at the eve of our independence, Guyana, Venezuela, and Brazil, and the Great Britain signed the Geneva Agreement. The Geneva Agreement is important in that it still serves as the most important element in this whole controversy. And it was Mr. Burnham, aided by very strong and professional people, Mr. Ramphal, Sir Ramphal, Mr. Rashley Jackson, and Ms. Shirley Phil Ridley, the late Shirley Phil Ridley, who actually negotiated and were critical in the signing of that Geneva Agreement, which served to ensure that we could go into independence with our borders intact. So one could argue here that in a real sense, the role of the Geneva Agreement continues to be a critical component in relation to the adjudication of this controversy. I think also it is important to observe that as a mechanism, the agreement was utilized not only for the Mixed Commission, which had 4 years to work, but it still serves, as I mentioned, as the agreement which is important indeed for the adjudication of this judicial process at the ICJ. I want to look at some of the issues related to Guyana's foreign policy at that time in the geopolitical context in which Guyana had to operate in the immediate post-independence period. Now, we begin with this foreign policy behavior in the early post-independence period. Guyana government, at the time of independence, devised a foreign policy which comprised of some major facets. The first being the protection of its territorial integrity and sovereignty, non-alignment, Caribbean unity, and support for the liberation struggles in Southern Africa. One might argue what all this has to do with the borders. I would like to posit that immediately after independence, recognizing that there were significant challenges to our borders. Remember, at independence, we had, in 1966, we had Suriname in the east, we had Venezuela to the west, and indeed, we had to defend our borders, meaning the borders with the Atlantic Ocean. So we had a series of challenges even at the very beginning of our independence, post-independence period. in a geopolitical context in which, in 1966, one could have recognized the emergence of the Cold War, a raging Cold War, country and the rivalry, East-West, the so-called Cold War era in which there were challenges in the hemisphere related to Russia or to the USSR and its rivalry with the United States for dominance in the hemisphere, especially after the 1959 Cuban Revolution, the 1962 Bay of Pigs. So we have to understand the context in which the government at independence had to operate. Now, I even read in my research where a former Venezuelan ambassador to Guyana, Sadio Garavini, in his book, argues that when compared to other countries of the English-speaking Caribbean, the major political parties of Guyana all demonstrated support for a position that Guyana's borders were sacrosanct. And I think that when you look at some of the arguments which have been advanced, Ferguson, for example, Tyrone Ferguson in 1999, argued that small states like Guyana, as infant nations, had to devise foreign policy in the immediate post-independence period in response to a geopolitical environment and a mix of domestic and international actions, and that as a small state, a small emerging state, lacking experience, diplomatic traditions and practices, as well as perhaps a strong diplomatic service, had to operate within its means. But one could argue here that even with the kind of challenges which were faced by the administration at the time under Forbes Burnham, we saw the very strong diplomatic effort being advanced to ensure that our border security and our territorial integrity remained intact. I remember in the early 1970s, when Guyana looked to ensure that it could broaden the levels of support, non-alignment became, the participation in the non-aligned movement became a significant element in Guyana's international relations. I also recall that by 1972, Guyana was in the forefront of the Caribbean integration effort, and we saw unambiguous support for Guyana's position in relation to its territorial integrity and sanctity of its borders and sovereignty, which unfortunately I see a reduction in the trajectory in relation to that kind of support in today's current regional environment. One cannot deny that the strategic plans of Guyana had to be built at that time around a geopolitical environment in which there was I think a issue, a very strong challenge based on our geopolitical and our geographical location in the hemisphere. You know, we looked at, we had to ensure that we broadened our scope of support, our levels of support. We had to look at a foreign policy that, you know, ensure that the range of international issues were surely dealt with. And in this Cold War competition for global dominance, small states like ours had to have an eclectic model, I would say, of foreign policy formulation and articulation. And there was a constricting framework by the presence of this rivalry. So even as a small state at the time, in a difficult geopolitical environment with a fledgling foreign service, I think there was a commitment demonstrated by all and an inclusiveness which I believe helped Guyana to maintain that level of support which it has been demonstrated over time. So we talked here about, in the 1970s, in the period when the liberation of Southern Africa was an important component in Guyana's foreign policy platform. We saw that type of commitment. And some might argue that that might have been a different kind of approach from, or it didn't have to do much with our territorial integrity. But I believe that the kind of commitment we demonstrated to that struggle against colonial rule in Southern Africa generated the type of support from the African continent, which I am confident we can reignite with a strong and robust diplomatic effort. Now, one has to remember also the domestic elements which were impacting our policies. One has to recall that in 1969, there was the Rupununi uprising, an attempt at secession in January, which took place at Guyana's borders. And I believe that brought a new element into play, as that was seen as the first, I think, and most serious threat to the national security and integrity of a newly independent state. This was seen, to my mind, as the country's earliest and most severe test of statehood. And so what we saw then is a very strong response with the kind of national support which I believe helped us in that particular period of our national development. I believe also that we saw at the time what has been termed the radicalization of Guyana's foreign policy. A dramatic increase in relations with the socialist world, links with the USSR, China, and I think that was an attempt also to broaden the range of support, especially in the context of this Venezuelan spurious claim. Remember also, by 1970, the government of Trinidad and Tobago, under Prime Minister Eric Williams, brokered the Protocol of Port of Spain, which allowed for a 12-year hiatus and an attempt to ensure that there was a de-escalation of the tensions of the time. In that particular context, I think the government of Guyana strategically, in a geopolitical context in which in the 1970s there was still concern about this Cold War situation, Guyana was able to de-escalate that and get some time to kind of beef up its both domestic capacity and its international reach. So we see in the 1970s, by 1982, there was the end of the Protocol of Port of Spain, and I recall that at that time there was a movement because the Venezuelans said that they no longer wanted the Protocol of Port of Spain, and in spite of all kinds of considerations given to the continuation of dialogue, that came to an end. I think it's also, well, at a personal level, I remember as a young university lecturer, I was invited to the office of the president when there was going to be a visit by President Burnham to Brazil. Brazil was still then under military rule. And we were looking at what would be some of the geopolitical and geostrategic issues that ought to be considered. We looked at making recommendations, and one of them was for the enhancement of relations via infrastructural development and linkages between Guyana and Brazil. And I remember Mr. Burnham, I was asked to go on that delegation with Mr. Burnham as head. When we discussed it, there was a signing of an agreement between Guyana and Brazil in 1982. So, in principle, agreed to the construction of a highway between Linden and Lethem. Now, there were some concerns. Why at this time? And it was quite clear that for us to sign such an agreement, it would mean that Brazil and Guyana agreed to a roadway that passed through territory that was being claimed by Venezuela. And one saw that as a very tactical, geopolitical, strategic element in the relationship. And Mr. Burnham and then President Figueiredo, then a general and still president of Brazil, still under military rule, we saw that type of strategic thinking emerging that also helped us to ensure that even though it took many decades before even a bridge was built between the Takatu, on the Takatu River, we saw that there was that commitment to the sanctity of borders, the inviolability of borders being demonstrated by Brazil. I would say also that as we moved into the 1990s, and the government of President Hoyt, there was the retention of that commitment to South American integration, with Brazil being very strong and present in that particular environment. So I think we should fast forward a bit to the 21st century. I want to look specifically at what is happening, or what happened in the 21st century, especially in the context of a new sector which has emerged in a changing global geopolitical environment. The preoccupation with that resource, I think, has generated interest and rivalry, and in a real sense, the level of bullyism, which I like to talk about, which has emerged, in some ways stems from that new resource which has come to Guyana. And therefore, it's a new geopolitical context altogether. So we have to, I think, readjust our thinking, readjust our approaches, and we see a new approach that is necessary, an inclusive approach that brings all of our stakeholders together in that bid to ensure that our resources benefit the people and are not dissipated or are not allowed to come under Venezuelan control. So I would say that while we've been very confident and we've been very successful over the years in embracing what has been termed defense diplomacy, a major plank in our foreign policy platform. And undoubtedly, since Guyana's independence, and we've been wary of a hostile neighbor, we've seen this pursuit of this type of diplomacy as our first line of defense. And I can say here again that we have to look at first of the concentric circles of international relations, our neighbors. I think we have to understand the potential role of Brazil. We have to understand the need to develop stronger linkages with countries like Colombia, who share some of the similar issues of boundary and border delineation with Venezuela, and therefore we need to look at the South American component of our international relations in a more structured and robust manner. I also believe that we have to ensure that we upgrade our global standing, and that has to be seen in the context of the pivotal role of a strategic foreign policy framework and a retreat from what I term transactional diplomacy, which seems to be the case at this time, which is, to my mind, short-term, unreliable, and not part of a grand strategy, which is necessary to ensure that we keep our territorial integrity and national sovereignty at the front and center of our foreign policy issue. I would say that given the current unprecedented level of Venezuela's aggression, we have to do a few things. And I think I would like to reiterate my view that there should have been already an approach to the United Nations Security Council, letting them understand of the existential threat which we see being exhibited here to Guyana. Additionally, I would like to see that there be, in relation to the present danger we face, there should be an immediate special meeting of CARICOM heads. They know that I've been pressing for that over the last couple of weeks. And I see it as important. Let us have before the 3rd of December. I said this to some students today, and I believe it ought to be seriously considered to ensure that the only item on that agenda is an expression by individual states and collectively of unequivocal support for Guyana in this particular territorial issue. I would also like to see CARICOM at that meeting actively consider, and I say this again, I've been one of those who's been pushing for it, actively consider the broadening and widening and deepening of a regional security system which can act in collaboration with a task force, multilateral, multinational in scope, that could serve as a strategic deterrence to any kind of potential aggression which Venezuela may want to produce in the short and medium term. It is not without, in a sense, a real understanding for us that we have a neighbor who has had experience in dealing with some of the issues in our region. Brazil has been one of the leaders in MINUSTAH. MINUSTAH was the United Nations sponsored stabilization mission in Haiti. And so with that type of experience, I think we can call on countries, including Brazil, to develop that kind of special mission. It could have a humanitarian component. And I believe that it can have a broad range of participation, including our hemispheric state, which tends to have its tends to have significant strategic interests in the hemisphere, more particularly now in Guyana's oil interests. As part of that strategic force, which would be a deterrent to potential Venezuelan action. In this case, I can see under the aegis of the United Nations a kind of force that would have both a humanitarian and a military deterrence function, which could have, positive impact on the outcome of this potential threat that we face, existential threat that we face. So I would say that this unprecedented action in 2023 deserves total national support. We cannot be divisive. There's no time, to my mind, for any kind of partisan approach. There must be a national effort. This must be engaged at several levels. The level of the people. I think, once again, I believe that there must be sustained engagement with the people of Guyana. Ensure they're updated, we all know what is happening, because the absence of information lends itself, as I mentioned before, to misconception, to mistrust, to misinterpretation, which we cannot afford, and all must be part of this effort. So we're talking about an approach that ensures information to the people of Guyana. At the second level, I think we must attempt to ensure that our range of support is enhanced internationally. We have to look at the African Union, because one could, as I recall, in the 1970s, we supported very strongly African liberation movement. I also believe that as we worked in the 1970s assiduously to ensure that the isolation of Cuba was removed, we should have the type of interaction with Cuba which could have some influence on Venezuela's potential aggression into a small state like Guyana. So we have to have a multiplicity of fronts that must be dealt with, even in the context of this changing global and regional geopolitical environment. I would also argue that we have some agencies, some organizations, of which Guyana is a part. We are part of the Association of Caribbean States, the ACS. As a matter of fact, Time for Action, which is a report of the West Indian Commission in the 1990s, talks about the widening and deepening of the integration movement simultaneously. And the region, CARICOM, was responsible, in a sense, for the birthing, for the genesis, for the establishment of the Association of Caribbean States. Now, I believe that that organization has not been fully utilized, and it is my view that Guyana must ensure that the ACS becomes, Association of Caribbean States, becomes fully sensitized and part of the effort. Equally as important is CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. And the Caribbean, CARICOM, is one of the quartet of countries that oversees the activities of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. And it is not insignificant that this year, the presidency, the pro tempore chairmanship of CELAC resides in the Caribbean in the person of the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Mr. Gonzalez, Dr. Ralph Gonzalez. And therefore, I would like to see a more structured engagement with the member states on this issue. And it requires adherence to the principles of international law, to the understanding about, the view that security and safety of the smaller states of that organization must be guaranteed. And therefore, I think that too, that organization also must be seen as an important element, an important component of this effort, in this effort. But as I mentioned, perhaps the most important approach is for you and me, the ordinary citizens of Guyana, which will ensure that the nation continues to speak with one voice. I therefore, once again, want to reiterate my view that we must all support the position that has been identified and articulated by all the stakeholders, government and opposition in Guyana, that the only appropriate forum for Venezuela to raise its territorial claim is the International Court of Justice. That mechanism has been clearly stated, and clearly the United Nations Secretary General has utilized that element in the United Nations Charter, and that should be respected. And already, on 2 occasions, even with Venezuela's concerns, the court has ruled that has jurisdiction in the matter and can adjudicate. So I believe that that indicates the correctness of the position of Guyana. That go to the ICJ. There's been dialogue for 6 decades. Dialogue hasn't worked. There's been the mixed commission. There's been the good office process, which has been enhanced. And that dialogue process has not yielded great success. So one could argue here that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, is the body that assures both Guyana and Venezuela that there would be a final, binding, and permanent settlement that is equitable, just, and consistent with international law. As I close, I want to reiterate my view that we are all in this thing together, as the song said. We have to work it out. We have to work out together as a Guyanese people, removing all the vestiges of divisiveness, that we have to work together to ensure that Essequibo remains ours. And as I said to these young students this morning, can we do it? Yes, we can. I want to thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Mr. Moderator, may I? Colleagues, comrades, friends, I wish to begin with an undisputed fact, which is that the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, commencing in 1966, has been and continues to illegally occupy land in the sovereign county of Essequibo in the form of the total occupation of the Ankoko Island, which itself forms part of the border between Guyana and Venezuela, and half of which belongs to the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. This, in essence, was Venezuela's gift to Guyana, which attained its independence in May 1966. So to all the speak out there about this particular issue, we have to remember we have been occupied by Venezuela since 1966. To this action, the government of Guyana filed successive objections via the international portals, and Venezuela's response was to remain in occupation of Ancoco Island. All of Guyana's territory, to which I shall refer, sprung from the 1899 Arbitral Award, which was and is a full, final, and perfect settlement of the borders between British Guyana, United Kingdom, and Venezuela, and from 1966 between the Cooperative Republic of Guyana and the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. With regards to the Cooperative Republic of Guyana's territorial integrity, Article 1.2 of Guyana's 1966 Constitution puts the matter of its territory in this manner, and I quote, the territory of Guyana shall comprise all the areas that immediately before the 26th of May 1966 were comprised in the former colony of British Guyana, together with such areas as may be declared by acts of parliament to form part of the territory of Guyana. Article 1.2, therefore, is consistent with international law to the extent that Guyana, as a newly independent state, became a successor state, the territory of which, that is British Guyana, immediately before independence, was a dependent territory for the international relations of which the United Kingdom was responsible. Therefore, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, at independence and thenceforth, became fully responsible for conducting its own international relations among other nations, in particular, sovereignty over its territory. Therefore, what we inherited from the British was consecrated at independence, and therefore, subsequent to that, we became totally responsible. Allow me to point out, moderator, at this juncture, an important fact, which is, as a successor state, Guyana can invoke before a tribunal all grounds of claim or objections which could have been invoked by the United Kingdom in the defense of British Guyana, and by extension in defense of Guyana. And that is exactly what we're doing at the ICJ. Therefore, the extent to which the United Kingdom exercised sovereignty over British Guyana, to that extent, Guyana, the successor state, exercises sovereignty over the same territory, of course, inclusive of Essequibo. In conformity with Article 1.2 of Guyana's 1970 Constitution, we know what 1970 and not 1966, that Constitution puts the issue of the territory in a similar manner as in 1966. And the same reasoning as the successor state applies to the 1970 Constitution. Further, Article 2 of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana's 1980 Constitution, famously referred to as the Burnham Constitution, puts the matter of its territorial integrity in this manner. It says, the territory of the state comprises the areas that immediately before the commencement of this Constitution were comprised in the area of Guyana, together with such other areas as may be declared by Act of Parliament to form part of the territory of the state. What the 1980 Constitution did was to receive the same territory in the 1970 Constitution, which had received the same territory in the 1966 Constitution. Most importantly, comrades, Article 1 of the Guyana's Constitution, 1980, as amended, puts the matter of its territory in the following manner. Guyana is an indivisible state. That means that its territory cannot be divided. That's the concept of indivisibility enshrined in our Constitution, Article 1.2. Allow me to make these three additional points, but critical, however, to this discussion. In addition to the indivisibility of the territory of the Republic of Guyana, nothing can be subtracted from Guyana's territory, but additions to it are contemplated. And these are expressed by the following words immediately above. That part of the article that says, and I quote, "Together with such other areas as may be declared by Act of Parliament to form part of the territory of the state," tells you we cannot subtract, but we can add. Secondly, Article 2 of the Republic of Guyana's Constitution, as amended, can only be amended by a national referendum. That is, a national elections. This is a continuation of the deeply entrenched nature of the territory of Guyana. Thirdly, the Republic of Guyana consistently declared in successive constitutions only that territory it received at independence from the United Kingdom. Guyana conducted no type of hegemonic acts against the people of, and territory of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. In contrast, the evidence shows that Venezuela has been and continues to be the nation-state aggressor. In view of the above, I posit that the borders of the Republic of Guyana are sacrosanct, indivisible, inalienable, and therefore non-transferable. And the same reasoning attaches, in the issue of successor state, attaches to all the constitutions of Guyana and the nation-state of Guyana. Interestingly, comrades, Article 10 of the Constitution of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela puts the issue of territory in this manner, and I quote, this is the Venezuelan Constitution, Article 10. The territory and other geographical spaces of the Republic are those which belonged to the Captaincy General of Venezuela before the political transformation began in April 1810, as amended by virtue of the treaties and arbitration awards, which have not been vitiated with nullity. In my view, comrades, the words "as amended by virtue of the treaties and arbitration awards, which have not been vitiated with nullity," are of crucial importance, in that the 1899 arbitration award, which is a full, final, and perfect settlement of the boundary between Guyana and Venezuela, has been and has not been vitiated with nullity. In fact, the 1899 arbitral award remained acceptable to Venezuela by its own constitution. For context, Venezuela became independent on the 5th of July, 1811, 88 years before the 1899 arbitration award. It means that the Venezuela Constitution contemplated arbitration in the future to determine its territory. And slavery, for context, ended in 1854, 43 years after Venezuelans' great Bolivarian independence. Importantly, the Republic of Venezuela comprises 23 states, none of which is a territory of Essequibo. This speaks to the consistency of the territory of Venezuela never comprising the territory of Essequibo over the history of the Venezuelan state. You heard my colleague Dr. Corton mention this action started 62 years after the 1899 arbitral award, when Guyana was approaching its own independence. In my view, what we see from Venezuela is hegemony, the behavior of a hegemon. That is a powerful state in relation to a smaller state. Apparently, comrades, without any concern for international law, particularly the UN's prohibition of the threat or use of force and respect for the territorial integrity and political independence of any state, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela prefers to resort to bellicose rhetoric and what the legal luminary of Guyana's team refer to as legal guerrilla warfare. That's what they're practicing, legal guerrilla warfare against Guyana. Its only intention is to intimidate the nation state of this country. Venezuela's actions are consistent with hegemonic conduct by a great power in pursuit of its objectives. So how does the hegemon operate? An important characteristic of the hegemon is an active demonstration that its interests must become the interests of all, referred to as hegemonic control. Hence Venezuela's conduct in the Caribbean. Hence Venezuelans behavior with other CARICOM states. Further, Venezuela has consistently misrepresented that the Geneva Agreement governing itself in Guyana only provides for bilateral dialogue to address the border controversy surrounding the full, final, and perfect settlement by way of the 1899 arbitration award. Comrades, this is patently false and the action of a hegemon. It is odious for Venezuela to try and convince particularly the learned, Guyanese in general, citizens of Latin America and the Caribbean, international government organization, among others, that the Geneva Agreement was intended for Guyana and Venezuela to determine the validity of the 1899 arbitration award. That is not true. Only a court can determine the validity. This is beyond preposterous, but is consistent with hegemonic conduct. Further, the consistent presidential decrees by Venezuela heads of state threatening and interfering with the settled boundary between Guyana and Venezuela, and the recently announced referendum by Venezuela purporting to annex the Guyana Esequibo territory are a reflection of a foreign policy towards the Republic of Guyana that is more realist than neoliberalist. In other words, a zero-sum game is the outcome that Venezuela seeks. And as posited by Justice Morsheimer, there is little evidence that institutions can convince the great powers to act against the dictates of realism. It is becoming clear to me that the institutions that exist are unable to get Venezuela to comply, because Venezuela has no intention of following these institutions in relation to Guyana. A fair question therefore arises: is Venezuela's hegemonic conduct towards Guyana an outlier, or do other threats await the region as it seeks to manage collective goods in and for the region? Also, the hegemon pays for influence. The hegemon also helps states make side payments and direct payments to them in order to secure cooperation. In my view, the Petro-Carib initiative is being used by Venezuela as a persuasion tool to secure cooperation of and otherwise influence CARICOM states to be at least ambivalent in their support to Guyana's territorial integrity, which is threatened by Venezuela. In this sense, Venezuela pretends to be a benevolent hegemon, and we've seen statements coming from CARICOM heads of state that are ambivalent. They're not too clear. Therefore, statements that call for Guyana, the non-aggressor, and Venezuela, the aggressor, to ensure the region remains a zone of peace, suggests to me a heeding to the wishes of the hegemon for fear of losing an economic benefit, that is oil. A question that naturally arises also. Meaning, for example, are these what Cox calls hegemonic orders? Are they designed for compliance by states within CARICOM? Is the action against Venezuela is the action by Venezuela against Guyana a ruse for subsequent action against CARICOM? We must not forget Board Island. CARICOM, on the other hand, comrades, as an international regime underpinned by institutional bargaining, ought to function as a counter to the hegemonic conduct by Venezuela. I'd like to turn to the threats by Venezuela and Guyana's response. Venezuela's referendum and spurious claim undermines 4 key factors of nationhood, and these factors were identified by Professor Griffith. That is our land, our people, our resources, and our identity. In other words, Venezuela's 5-question referendum is an attack on Guyana's national security, national interests, and national values. In short, the nation's patrimony. Further, looked at historically, Venezuela has always posed an existential threat to Guyana, given its history of operating as an economic hitman against our people. Some responses and challenges by Guyana. Over the past 6 decades, the Cooperative Republic of Guyana firstly depended on defense diplomacy, and Dr. Corton did refer to it. And this defense diplomacy is underpinned by Article 37 of the Guyana Constitution, which focuses, among others, on sovereign equality, meaning we are equal to Venezuela. Secondly, inviolability of frontiers, and we have never violated anybody's frontier. Territorial integrity of states, we practice that. And non-intervention in internal affairs of other states. That's the ground norm, so to speak, of our foreign policy. It's in our constitution. Clearly, the actions of Venezuela offend Guyana's constitution and its patrimony. As I pointed out earlier, Venezuela's own actions are contrary to Article 10 of its own constitution. Concomitantly, comrades, Guyana subscribes to the sanctity of treaties. We uphold treaties. We believe in treaties in accordance with international law, and has conducted its foreign relations with this as a primary objective within the boundaries of Article 37 of our Constitution. I now turn to the concept of total national defense, touched on by Dr. Curtin. Again, over the past 6 decades, we dealt with defense diplomacy. We've dealt with the issue of sovereign equality. However, together with the provisions of Article 1, which I mentioned, Article 2 of the Guyana Constitution on the borders of Guyana, together with those, we find that the Constitution lays out the borders of the Republic of Guyana. And as I mentioned, only a national referendum can change those borders. It is important to keep repeating it. Only a national election can change our borders. Not the voice of an individual, not the president, not the prime minister, not an ex-minister. Only in national elections can change our borders. For context, it was the government of the People's National Congress that deeply entrenched the borders of Guyana in the nation's successive constitution. That's what we did as a party. For clarity, the record shows that successive PNC and later coalition governments were always concerned with protecting the territory this nation received at its independence. So to those who speak from time to time and suggest that the Geneva Agreement that President Burnham signed had anything to do with losing territory, they are wrong. Let me make it very clear. The Geneva Agreement does not speak about Essequibo. The Geneva Agreement does not speak about the border. Those two things are not in the Geneva Agreement. It speaks of the border controversy. And that controversy is because a gentleman wrote a letter only to be opened when he died to say that the arbitration procedure was false. But that letter has never been produced by Venezuela, as far as we know. We've never seen it. And that's all that Venezuela have. So technically, Venezuela was checkmated by the Geneva Agreement because they were dealing with a legal luminary called Forbes Burnham. He was checkmated, so they cannot discuss Essequibo, they cannot discuss the border controversy, so they resorted to keep pressuring Guyana to have bilateral talks in an effort to resolve the issue, which we know is impossible because it's now before the ICJ. Abhorrently, comrades, recent suggestions by a member of the current government about giving away some of Guyana's territory is anti-nationalist and anti-patriotic. To be clear, the Constitution of Guyana does not provide for giving away any of Guyana's territory except by a national elections. Therefore, no president, no vice president, or cabinet minister has any constitutional authority to negotiate away any of Guyana's territory. And we must understand that. We must repeat that and tell it to our comrades and tell it to the people of Guyana. No individual can bargain our territory. Secondly, comrades, at the international level, defense diplomacy requires continuous diplomatic interactions by Guyana's diplomats and special envoys across regional and global capitals and international institutions. I know Dr. Corton touched on it, so I wouldn't bore you too much with it. However, the success of this type of action manifests in strong international condemnation and possible intervention by friendly forces on Guyana's behalf, which acts as a counterweight against Venezuela. In short, such actions, that is, intense diplomatic efforts by our embassies and special envoys, would give an aggressor a cause to pause. That was the practice of the successive PNC governments. We always give Venezuela cause to pause because we used diplomacy and we had international allies and international friends to our side. The government of Guyana should immediately consider this type of diplomatic action instead of its current convoluted approach. Thirdly, underpinned by Article 33 of the Guyana Constitution, arose the concept of total national defense. This is where the total national material and human resources are organized and deployed to achieve total national defense in defense of the country's territorial integrity against any external aggression. This article commands every citizen to defend Guyana. It says it is the duty of every citizen to defend Guyana. That's Article 33, put in there by the PNC during who is government, by whom the late, great Forbes Burnham. The government is advised to let the citizens know that defending Guyana's territorial integrity is the duty of all citizens and not exclusively that of the Guyana Defense Force. What is not coming from the government is each of us has a responsibility to be part of defense. Each of us. Both the private sector, the public sector, the rich and the poor, and the not so rich and the not so poor. Each of us has a responsibility to defend this nation. All those institutions with resources have a duty to deploy those resources to the Guyana Defense Force so the Guyana Defense Force can ably defend this nation. In this context, the government is further advised to tap into and harness all the human resources available in this country. The unity approach of defense in the defense of Guyana does not end with parliamentary speeches, comrades. As is the case, it continues until the nation state of Guyana is returned to territorial safety. Finally, defense diplomacy by itself is insufficient. The government of Guyana must provide the Guyana Defense Force with adequate and operable defense assets so it can effectively defend the nation state. What might be Venezuela's ultimate objective? And I will close here. When I analyze the dangerous and bellicose language used by Venezuelan officials in support of its referendum, which is internationally illegal, which is unlawful, that referendum is Essequibo, and the fact that of the 23 states in Venezuela's constitution, none is Essequibo, it is not beyond reason that such alarming actions by Venezuela may well be a ruse, a trick, for President Maduro, via the expected yes to question 5, which is the annexing of Essequibo, to turn and tell the Venezuelan people that he had a referendum, you agreed to Venezuela, to Essequibo being part of Venezuela, and therefore now we will incorporate it as the 24th state in the Constitution of Venezuela. I believe, comrades, that is the ultimate objective of President Maduro. And that is what the government of Guyana and the CARICOM region must guard against. That is a message that our diplomat must speak in global capitals, that this is something Venezuela is planning. Because, as I said before, all through the history of Venezuela, it never enshrined, never placed Essequibo in its constitution. Never. And I believe this is what Maduro is planning to do right now. I thank you very much for listening to me.
Comrades, you have heard our 3 panelists. They have enriched our knowledge on the issue at hand. We now have a better understanding of the history behind Venezuela's claim. A history which goes back to the whole politics of conquest and occupation among the European powers, be it the Dutch, the Spaniards, and others. That's where it all started. We have been advised, however, that throughout all of this, that the evidence of occupation and succession, and most importantly, the 1899 award specifies which territory we have inherited as an independent nation. And that mischief is afoot when we hear about the spurious claims 60 years after the demarcation, the award was granted, and the subsequent demarcation of our territory was determined. This is what we have to protect, the Guyana that we know. Interesting, very interesting was the last presentation from the perspective of citing the legal regimes, both the international legal regimes, the Guyana legal regime, and the Venezuelan legal regime, all of which clearly identifies what belongs to Guyana. And that it is only a referendum where the Guyanese people speaks on the matter that can lead to any change in our territory. And I want to take the opportunity to comment on one specific aspect of what was said in the context of us understanding we have to be united on this question of protecting our territorial integrity and our sovereignty. There is no option in that regard. But as we do that, we have to be careful of shenanigans. Most of you should have heard the Vice President's press conference yesterday. In which press conference, he sought to refer to one of our parliamentarians as a low-life person. Specific reference to Cathy Hughes. From a gender perspective, and from a perspective of decency, what he did was unacceptable. But he did that in defense of his low life. And I say that for this reason. Vice President Jagdeo has attempted to suggest that the question of a channel in our waters being granted to the Venezuelans is a matter that was raised under the Hoyt regime. Well, in fact, it might have been raised then. We know of the processes we've gone through, and that anything could have been raised. But it is clear that no such thing was accepted or finalized. No such thing, even if raised, was accepted or finalized under the Hoyt regime. And the records are clear in that regard. But the records are also clear that such a thing was ventured under the Jagdeo regime. And I say that without any fear of contradiction, because I consider myself a witness of that venture. I attended, observed 2 elections in Venezuela. And during one of those observations, I had interaction and detailed conversation with a senior Guyanese official. And that senior Guyanese official, who for the time being, name will remain unmentioned, indicated to me that under the Jagdeo regime, when Maduro was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and when he visited Guyana, that on that visit, in discussions with the then President of Guyana, it was concluded that a path would be granted to the Venezuelans through our territorial waters. That was disclosed to me. And so it's not a question of Catiyus or anybody accusing Jagdeo. It's a matter of fact. It was also disclosed to me that the reason why that agreement was not, there was no attempt to enforce it, was that when Maduro returned to Venezuela, before they could make it official in Venezuela, the information was leaked. And because it was leaked, then the Venezuelan opposition and others became aware of it. And in fact, opposed any such idea. And as a consequence, the Chavez government could not go ahead with what had been agreed between the then Guyana government and the Venezuelan government in the persons of President Jagdeo and Foreign Affairs Minister Maduro. Of course, you have heard that that would have been illegal because no individual can sign away our territory. Our territory can only be changed by a referendum. So that would have been illegal anyhow. But that is the single instance of an attempt of a government and a government official to come into collusion with the Venezuelans to give away the right to our territory. And I thought I should use this forum to reinforce that understanding, since there seems to be a war going on right now where Jagdeo and his crony on Facebook and in press conferences are trying to distract people's attention from the evil deed that he sought to commit. Colleagues, you've heard those presentations. The Burnham Foundation is in the business of public education, and that's why we have brought those presentations to you. Public education includes clarity, and therefore I'll now open the floor for questions and comments and possible answers to your questions. Please be concise with your questions. Time is of the essence. And insofar as you pose questions, I'll ask the panelists to attend to those questions. We will not answer each individual question. We'll take about 3 or 4, then the panelists will respond. So the floor is now open for questions. I think I recognize someone already approaching the mic. Please go ahead. You're not required to state who you are, where you came from. Your very presence here is sufficient for you to pose your question.
Thank you, Committee Chairman. Some of the speakers alluded to the Cold War, and I want to ask a question pertaining to the Cold War. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, both the Jagans, Janet and Cherry Jagan, bragged that they had friends with rockets. They had friends with rockets. This is in the era of Cold War, when our neighbors, Brazil and Venezuela, and the entire Central America, were all under right-wing military governments, meaning they were all pro-West. And the Jagans' loyalties, the first loyalty was to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The second loyalty was to world communism. The third loyalty was to the USSR. And that is why they bragged during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the USSR was trying to install missiles in Cuba. They bragged that they had friends with rockets. And I want to say that that gave what Jagan called the imperialists. He himself said that the Venezuelan claim was machinations on the part of imperialism. And I want to say, and I want to ask, if they're bragging about they had friends with rockets, if that was not cause, did not give the Venezuelans a cause to make the claim that they made, a false claim. And just as a backup to that, when the Venos took over Ankoko, at that time, the song "Not a Blade of Grass" was popular, and that was the slogan. The Mirror newspaper carried a cartoon, and in that cartoon, when Forrest Burnham, the Prime Minister, was saying "not a blade of grass," there was a Veno soldier throwing dirt in his face. Dirt in his face. That's the cartoon the Mirror paper ran. Is that nationalistic? Huh? Is that nationalistic? So what I'm asking the panel, if they don't think the Jagans bragging of they had friends with rockets contributed to the Veno claim on Esquivel, a false claim.
I see a second person approaching the mic.
Good night, everybody, members of the panel, moderator, all. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for speaking to us this evening on the topic. A lot of what was said I knew, and a lot that was said I did not know. So thank you for that. My first question is to Dr. Curtin. Both you and Dr. Best would have mentioned that Guyana is a member of CARICOM, which we know. And Dr. Curtin, you would have specifically stated that we should utilize our diplomatic relations with groupings that we're part of to edify them on our controversy with Venezuela. However, I noticed you didn't mention UNISAR, which is Guyana is a member of both along with Venezuela. So my question would be, where are your thoughts in that area, being that we're in an international group with the person that we have, with the nation that we have this controversy with. So what are your thoughts there, and your silence specifically on the issue? And the other part of the question for Dr. Curtin is specifically for the Lima group. So Guyana is a part of the Lima group, which was established in 2017, and among a list of things, they criticized Venezuela for the breakdown of democratic order in that nation. So with the December 3rd referendum that's coming up, the Lima group is silent. Now I know Guyanese politics, local politics play a lot with our international relations, who we're tight with and who we're not tight with. I know under the Granger administration, we had a lot of conversation with UNISAR and the Lima group with regards to our issues with Venezuela and making our positions known. But then when the government changed with Ali administration, it seems like conversations were clipped with UNISAR and Lima. However, considering the fact that Lima was established to criticize and to try to restore order in Venezuela, they're completely silent about this referendum that's coming up. So I want to know what your thoughts are there. Thank you.
Thank you. We take a third question.
Yeah, good evening, members of the panel. Let me thank the three gentlemen for enlightening us on this controversy. I wouldn't want to focus on the historical data that you have provided. My concern really is the country being faced with this issue. I want to go back and say when this thing was floated around independence, I recall the government then introduced what we call, and in this case we're talking about Forbes Burnham and public education, introduced in every organization, institution, ministries, schools, communities, clubs, and every group around when this slogan, every citizen a soldier, was part of our vocabulary then. What I'm not getting, what I'm not seeing, what I'm not hearing, I understand that they have some PR person in the office of the president doing things. I'm not seeing this thing being put out in schools, communities, organizations like it used to be when we were young, when I was much younger. When this thing came about, because of this slogan, every citizen a soldier, everyone knew what the position was with Venezuela and what the position was in Guyana. I'm not getting that. I'm not seeing it. First point. Secondly, I want to suggest that these gentlemen, because I'm part of the foundation too, they should put together in a presentation and a document, because we may find it very useful in years to come. So, Mr. Curtin, Dr. Bess, and my young friend, dear Mr. Benjamin, because all of you have provided information that are very useful. And for us in the foundation, this question of public education is something that is very important. It was my view when we arranged this thing, putting it out there, we would have been able to have a captive audience here to deal with this subject. But like I said, the effort being put out by the central government in relation to this matter is very disappointing. I am very, very glad. I don't know if members of the media are here, but I want to suspect it will find itself in the media. But this bit of information that Mr. Alexander has just given us in relation to the Vice President and his illegal conduct when he was Vice President with the government of Venezuela, trying to give a part. I see them trying to defend it in the media. But I'm saying to all of us, our Vice President is equivalent to the devil. He's a wicked person to do something like that. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm hoping that many more forums of this type can be organized. Not very large group, but it must be in all organizations, all schools, clubs, youth groups, churches. That is what we need to see happening, and the supportive material to make sure that we don't have to come to forum. But since you go in a minibus, you must hear about this thing. Since you jump in a taxi, you must be hearing about this. Since you go to a club meeting or a church, you must hear about it. That is how Burnham did it. That is how he did it. And everybody was educated on this matter. I thank you.
We'll take the fourth contribution, then we'll have a round of answers.
Good evening. Mr. Alexander always calls me the geographer and I am a geographer, as some people on the forum know that. One thing that was missing from the presentation, which was more than excellent, by Mr. Dwayne, Benjamin, and my friend Mark, and the Rear Admiral. One thing what was missing was the geographical element in all aspects, right? Mr. Dwayne is a historian. Mark touched on geopolitics. He mentioned geography several times, and the Rear Admiral covered it. But there were many geographical aspects that were missing from this discussion. The basic thing is, when you're talking about border, you're talking about land. You're talking about drawing the land. I know Mark went to Brazil a few years ago on the APNU, and they had to verify the delimitation of the Guyana and the Brazilian boundary. I participated in 2007 in exactly the same thing. I was living in Brazil at that time, and they called me to represent them on that, because there was a Guyanese delegation there, and they had problems with understanding the language. But it's the exact point about the land. So the geographical aspect must not be forgotten. But the bigger geographical aspect that was not touched on today is the question of the resources, the minerals. And that is exactly the issue. The issue is our natural resources. That point is so crucial that we cannot leave it out of the discussions. Because when we look at what Venezuela is claiming, it is our 90% part of our country where our minerals are. Which brings me to my second point. I am an educator, and we have very near to here, if we go that way north, the National Museum. In the National Museum, there is a room which has more than 20 maps. Once again, it's geography. More than 20 maps which highlight the issue of the Venezuela and Guyana border issue. The entire room. How many of you have visited that museum in the last 20 years? Right? I visited it 3 months ago, and I took photographs, which I have on my cell phone, but I highlighted, I studied preparing for this problem, this symposium, and I took out 6 maps, which I have, which I can pass on to the guy with the technology. For those of you who do not want to go, I'm suggesting everybody here go to that room at the museum and see this room and the issue of the maps, because the issue is land on the ground, and it is about maps. I've been putting in on Facebook for the past month. All teachers must take all Guyanese children in every school level, and even at UG, the Department of Geography, to that room and see those maps. Venezuelan children learn about Guyana at the age of 5. They see Venezuela as part of their territory. Mr. Alexander did not say that it is included officially, but they have printed maps more than 40 years ago. I attended a fellowship in Brazil on the Treaty of Amazonas Cooperation. The only person in the group of representatives, there were two from Venezuela. I was the only Guyanese on this fellowship. And the only person in the group that spoke English, apart from one Brazilian girl, was the Venezuelan guy, Hector. So I became very close and very friendly with him. But the maps that he and Ruben, the other Venezuelan guy, presented, we all had to make presentations, showed the Essequibo in their maps. So first, we need to know what is there. Second is the question that Mark and Vincent has mentioned about public education. We have got to get all our children and grandchildren going to the museum and seeing the maps in that room. There are also the minerals on display, but the maps in that room gave a clear indication of what Mr. Benjamin talked about, going back, way, way, way back. I have 6 of the maps here with me that I brought to this symposium, but the issue of the geography, of the maps of the land is the issue of all Guyanese. We do not know. I met a guy this morning, and I'm finishing here. I met a guy this morning, he's a police officer. He was in the city mall. So I called him and I asked him a few questions. I wanted to find out if his uniform was the only uniform he had, or how many copies of it. I really wanted that question cleared up in my mind. But I mentioned about the Rupununi uprising. He had absolutely no idea what I'm talking about. He is a police officer. He is at least 25 years old. He knows nothing of the Rupununi uprising. Mark mentioned that. Okay? Mark knows my relationship to that. But the point is, the people in Guyana, 40 years and younger, this guy's now 40. Tell me something about Rupununi Somali. You don't know. They don't know. Anybody under 40 in Guyana does not know anything unless they're a school teacher about the Rupununi Savannah. And that was identical to what is happening now. That was their first test of it. Then in 1976, it's just one point that Mark skipped over today. He didn't mention. When we had our hydro project, Venezuela instigated the World Bank to refuse our application for a loan to develop our hydropower. Venezuela uses the friends that they have when they wish to get what they want. And they are using them now, even Maya Motley, right? And the Caribbean oil project. We have oil, so we can give our Caribbean people oil. But that is the issue. The issue is the resources and the maps. Venezuela uses friends and other people to get what they want. We've got to use, as Mark said. I will finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'll now ask the panelists to respond to the questions.
Okay, I wonder if I could start with a question that is directed to me directly, and maybe later on attempt to answer the others. The question raised was one of Guyana's links with UNASUR, if I remember correctly, and the Lima Group, and why Guyana hasn't been more aggressive in that approach. Now, in the first instance, the Lima Group, of which Guyana was a member, or affiliated to, was one that actually supported Guaido as the legitimate president. Now, Guyana's argument for participation was that there was this threat to Guyana's, or it continues to be this threat. And so in that context, right, they weren't supporting, the government wasn't, I think it was 2017, but Guyana wasn't supporting the Guaido approach, but it was putting the broader principle of their maintenance of the territorial integrity, that component of it. The Lima Group since has been reduced in its scope significantly, but the other question is of the UNASUR, the Union of South American States. Now, that was initiated with a strong influence from Brazil, President Lula, in 2009, I think it was. I can't remember the exact year. And a very strong element included the potential South American Defense Council. The then government of President Jack Dio and then President Ramotar did not support Guyana's accession to that component of UNASUR. But I think that under the APNU, well, even before APNU's move to government, accession to government, there was the view that the linkages with UNASUR must be enhanced. However, there was a time when the government changed in Brazil, and Brazil was a strong leader of South American integration and really the proponent of UNASUR, and moving the process forward vigorously to ensure South American integration, economic. There was the emergence of the IRSA project, which is the initiative for the integration of infrastructure in South America that came under UNASUR. But then there was a change of government in Brazil. A man called Bolsonaro. President Bolsonaro, first of all, delinked from this progressive organization and actually saw its de-escalation in terms of its movements. As a matter of fact, they removed, Guyana is still a member of UNASUR, but there was an organization that was championed by President Bolsonaro called PROSUR, which was intended to replace the very multilateralist approach of UNASUR. I think the government of Bolsonaro in Brazil at the time removed itself from multilateralism, from several issues that were important to South America, like deforestation, which is a very critical element for UNASUR. As a matter of fact, the linkages in the period of COVID, as a matter of fact, Bolsonaro argued there was nothing like COVID, and saw Brazil having a high level of mortality rate as a result of COVID, so that there were a sense of a reduction in the activities of UNASUR. Now, here we have the re-election of President Lula da Silva in Brazil. And I'm of the view that whether in name UNASUR or any other structure, there's going to be a very strong, in the immediate future, a very strong rebirth of South American integration. And I'm confident that with Lula's kind of leadership and his view that there must be strong South American integration efforts, and the fact that Brazil, I think at this stage, is poised to retake that kind of global position, I think we will see in South America a new kind of rebirth, a re-engineering of UNASUR, which I'm confident that could be a very important institutional arrangement which Guyana must participate, in which Guyana must participate. So I don't think that we've lost that view that we must continue to participate vigorously in the South American integration process. And I believe that, I think next year, by early next year, and they already started with a Brazilian initiative with a meeting of South American leaders. And I think that is a precursor to what may be emerging as a new UNASUR in the not too distant future. So to say that Guyana is not participating, I think the organization lost its rhythm after the leadership of Lula terminated, and then with Mr. Bolsonaro and ProSur as an organization that was intended not to be strongly multilateral in its approach. So I believe that we will soon have a return to that kind of vigorous South American integration efforts. And I think that was the question. That was the second question you asked.
Vincent, excuse me. Unfortunately, I have to leave to have to catch a boat to go over the West Demerara.
I'm about to address.
I'm saying I have to leave to go over the river to get back to West Demerara. So maybe I could organize such a forum for the West Demerara folks. All right?
Yeah, but thanks very much. I'm going to respond to the question you asked, though.
Yeah, but
No, I won't be long.
the last boat is 8 o'clock, so I have to make sure I get over there because I didn't drive over here.
Less than a minute.
Okay.
I think the question you asked is an interesting question, but I wouldn't respond to it from the perspective of we have missiles coming from the then PPP, Dr. Jagan, that's prior to independence. I think that the political outlook of the PPP then would have contributed to the views held by United States and United Kingdom in relation to Guyana at the time of independence. And to some extent, that could have emboldened Venezuela. In that sense, I think, yes, there's some merit in that kind of analysis and thinking that it could have been emboldened, but I don't think the claim itself is linked to that. I think the actions subsequent to its spurious claim, those actions are linked to that because the claim itself came from the posthumous letter, which they use as a trick, as I would say, to convince others, countries, that we have something going on. So that would be my answer to that question that Malcolm asked. If I may comment on, let's go to my notes here. If I might comment here, I don't have an answer to the question raised, how does Guyana operate within the grouping in which Venezuela sits at the time when Venezuela is threatening Guyana? I think the extent to which I understand diplomacy, it's a tough one, but I think it will show the mettle of our diplomats, for our diplomats to conduct themselves in the same forum with Venezuela at the time when Venezuela is threatening Guyana. I think Dr. Court will agree with me that there's no need for us to withdraw. We can't withdraw from that. You have to stay engaged. That's diplomacy. The more you speak, the less you fight. You have to keep talking. People say the UN is a talk shop. It is a talk shop because once you talk, you don't fight. The other point I want to raise is, I want to contribute to, is that there are three things we need to do, and this is to the comment made by the gentleman about public information and so forth. The government needs to inform, motivate, and then mobilize. There's three things the government should be doing. What we're seeing now is an attempt at informing. But at no stage the government is close to motivating the population and mobilizing the population. So forums like these are very important because we really can't depend on the government. So what is identified as critical indeed is a big gap. But I don't think we can expect the government to fill this gap because I don't think it's grounded in their political philosophy. There's no unity grounded there. It's simply about getting the opposition to a point in time in Parliament to have a joint statement and after then go it alone. For example, I mentioned unity doesn't end with the parliamentary speeches. We have a post on Facebook showing the President and Commander-in-Chief on some border location, I'm not sure, with our troops. So if you look at the picture very carefully, it doesn't really reflect, it doesn't make the GDF look as professional as it is. It looks as though it's a walk in the park by the President. He's lying in a hammock with some troops around him, and they're not completely dressed because of the time when he went. One can read so much into a photograph, really perhaps diminishing the effect of the Guyana Defense Force and make them look awkward in the photograph with the President. As a member of the Guyana Defense Force, I don't take too lightly to that. That kind of representation being put out there by I don't know what to call it, but to say that the kind of media spotlight that is placed by the President and his team. So in addition to motivating, like informing, motivating, mobilizing, I do agree that geography matters. What we didn't mention is that there is a maritime boundary that Guyana has delimited based on the land boundary. We have a maritime boundary, 240,000 square kilometers of maritime space is also part of Guyana. So from the land boundary that was settled in 1899, Guyana drew its western boundary, and as you might be aware, its eastern boundary was delimited by International Court of Justice. So we have all those waterways, all those waters offshore, and the minerals belong to Guyana. So let's not forget that we have 240,000 square kilometers of sea space that we also own, and we have already delimited based on the land boundary. So I thought that it was important to mention that also as we speak about territorial integrity of Guyana. And here I can pause. Take a pause here.
All right, I'll take another 2 or 3 questions, then we wrap up the questions. I think I've seen all of the aspirants already. So please proceed.
Good evening. I am Damien LaRose.
Please be concise. Time is
Yes.
catching up with us.
My direct question is, with what is happening within our country and we see what is there with Venezuela, is there a system in place where we could go, we say reconnaissance, to get information so that we can know beforehand, instead of having someone to be posting something on the media that Venezuela is planning to invade? So do we have intelligence there to give us information, not just for Venezuela, but any other country? Although we know we have Venezuela, I want to state that in the Parliament of Suriname, they have a part of our country on their map. And so we can see sometimes when a fire breaks out over there, someone takes an opportunity to start another fire somewhere else. So that is just my comment and my question.
Take the next question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the panel. Allow me to say thanks for this very explanatory meeting this evening. I want to raise 2 questions. First, can anyone in the panel say why Nicaragua is supporting Venezuela in this claim? Number 2, I want to speak on Dr. Best's point of total defense. There is an aspect of total defense in this situation, which is patriotism. As a small boy, we used to march and so on. The Venezuelans were very worried in 1977 when we formed the local defense things, when people used to go in the afternoons and learn to march and shoot and so on, they complained that we were preparing for war. I do not see, we don't even have a boys, we don't have girls' guides now. We have nothing which teaches our young people patriotism. Nothing at all in this country. This makes them feel they're part of a country and are supposed to make sacrifices for a country. In the 70s, we had defense bonds. If you're as old as I am, you will know about defense bonds. We did things that made Venezuela know that we are prepared to defend our country. And finally, I want to ask, to say that I am taking up Dr. Curtin's point on the question of international relations and so on. We have been very, very helpful to Cuba in its efforts around the world. Guyana allowed the Cuban planes to refuel in Guyana when it launched its efforts in Southern Africa. I'm not airing any word about our relations with Cuba. I think Cuba is very, very, very important in the relations with Venezuela. I know, let me be stronger than that. I know that Cuba can play a part, and I want to know why we're not hearing more about Cuba. Thank you.
Good afternoon, gathering. I want to really commend the Burnham Foundation for this symposium and to really give a word of gratitude to the presenters that would have delivered to us this afternoon. I want to make a couple of points. One is that I think Dr. Best would have established that a little earlier on when he established that ever since our presence here in Guyana, since 1621 all the way through, there has never been any successful claim or any particular defense by Venezuela during any of the issues we had, whether it's an uprising, revolution, anything such. They were never part of that process all the way through. So there is a very strange coincidence of them wanting to have a claim at this juncture. I want to ask if we can make a definitive statement with respect to the referendum that is planned for the 3rd of December. Because as was said, a referendum speaks to a certain space. So the people of Venezuela can have a referendum to do what they want, whatever they want in their space. But when it comes to them impacting on another territory, that's definitely off records. And so I wonder, I didn't get it very clear from Dr. Bess as to what action or articulation we can use in that respect, whether to ignore them or to guard against any efforts that might be forthcoming. My third point is in relation to hegemony and the fact that it is very strange that a nation will want to use its security apparatus to demonstrate or to have the wordings of a country that's opposing you in terms of the police here thing we had on our police vehicles at one stage. That seems to me, or it appears to me, as if it was a conformity to some action or thing that was agreed to at some place in time. And I think it came out very clear that indeed there was, and so it's a play through to an action or a pledge organized earlier. My question is, having consideration for the fact that each citizen has a right and responsibility to defend the Guyana, and the fact that this current administration seems oblivious or perhaps in bed with Venezuela on the whole process moving forward, what course of action do we have? Because it is certainly not an action by the state to represent this country. what other option do we have to engage to make sure that the land of Guyana remains 83,000 square miles across? Thank you.
Good night to the entire panel and thanks for the presentations of this evening. My question is that the person from the army, I can't remember your titles, who spoke about the picture that was being taken by the installed de facto president with the soldiers. We can all say that since they have come into power, they treat the soldiers with a lot of disdain, because they have soldiers on Sundays cleaning the gutters and the dirty areas in Georgetown, when soldiers should be treated with dignity to defend our country. The latest slap is that if the soldier goes to the border to defend this country that they claim is their own, they cannot give us lands and the different things, they will be given a house lot. What if this problem goes away without any type of engagement? I would like to know if the soldiers will still have that house lot. Also, there was mention where the vice president openly abused a member of parliament. We should all know by now that the installed regime does not treat women with respect. I could remember I was at a forum and I spoke about the abuse women are going through since the installed regime and prior to them has taken over. Because if we go back to the former president, how we treated First Lady Vashni, we don't want any more type of abuse to be this thing. Now everybody is talking CARICOM, CARICOM, CARICOM. CARICOM has no interest in Guyana. And I feel that Guyana should remove themselves from CARICOM. The only thing CARICOM has Guyana in its chest for is for me to come and collect land to graze the sheep. The other one come here to get some of the oil. All of them. Now everybody's jumping down on Dr. Rowley for not backing Guyana. But Guyanese people, some of them got a short memory. They remember when Barrow Jack, you cuss out Rowley. And if I cuss you out, I mustn't go to you when I got problems last. That is one thing I was against President Granger for. Now if I got a neighbor, and me and my neighbor can't agree, you think if my neighbor murdering the children, I gonna let it come over at me? No. We knew that Venezuela always looking to take away Guyana land. And when they claim that they were in problems, Guyana should have said to the international world, we have a problem with these people and our land, and we cannot take them in as refugees. Now we want to know what will happen to them. They came here as refugees, if they will be added to the list. Now Guyana, nobody talking about that. Now the Venezuelans are here. You're hearing about many, you're seeing the evidence, how they are destroying homes. You cannot talk to them. They're taking over this place. And what they are doing, they are peopling from Burusiri back to the western boundaries of Guyana. You may have few of them in the other areas in Guyana, but mainly from Burusiri on the west coast of Demerara, that is East Coast Essequibo. They're occupying there, and they're creating havoc in those areas. And the police can do nothing with what goes on in those places. And I would like this forum, as people are asking, for it to spread out and let people know. Because the installed regime has no time to let anyone know what is going on. For us to get any idea, you might see a police, not police, a soldier, and the soldier might tell you something. But other than that, you're not getting anything. And if this installed regime was a patriotic and a proper government, they would have had constant upgrades and information all over the place to let people either be prepared for an impending war or to have a thing to know, well, this is what is going on. That's why Burnham in his wisdom had things like national service, people's militia, and the different upgrading, stepping up, so that those people would have been able to back the army. And he did not have soldiers cleaning the streets, cleaning the trenches, and taking away meaningful jobs from sanitation workers.
We'll take a final question as we start to wind down.
Yeah, quickly, I just want to reinforce the same point on the soldiers and the same picture that Dr. Bess would have mentioned. We see on DPI. We saw aggression by the Venezuelan government, their soldiers at the borders, etc. And in dealing with that, we would have sent our soldiers to the borders as well. But what we see as, yet again, is not a level of disrespect to our soldiers. We saw a picture, and I wanted, the question I'm trying to ask basically is on the protocol. Because then we have our army men, as you said, not properly dressed, they faced exposed, and they're there in a relaxed position. When the reason they're there is because there seems to be some threats to the borders. Even though we understand the differences between our strength when it comes to the military against Venezuela's strength. But yet again, they're there to at least seek some level of protection against the borders. I want to know what, from your background in the military, is there any protocols towards the media coming out, the president having a publicity stunt to come and say, you know, I've been camping out with our army men at the borders. What's the protocol there? Because I think the comrade before spoke very much about, you know, how the military people have been treated in this country, you know, cleaning drains, etc. Now when is the time for them to rise to some level of defense? They then seen hanging out in hammocks, eating with the president, and this, you know, in a more laissez-faire situation. Let's just say we didn't have that courtesy of the other countries who may have strong militaries. What would be the cause of that? That's my question to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now ask the panelists to respond to the questions and at the same time to have their last words.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for those questions, and there are a few things I would like to say. First is that one of the important issues raised was integration, Caribbean integration, CARICOM. I recall the strenuous efforts of Mr. Burnham to lead the integration effort. And I believe that in accordance with, or in support of a legacy of Mr. Burnham, we should make every effort to bring CARICOM, bring the integration effort back to that pristine period, that excellent period. We see efforts by Venezuela to fragment the integration effort. Some argue with some success. But my view is that there must be a very strong effort led by Guyana, the people of Guyana. So you can do second-tier, second-track diplomacy to ensure that our brothers and sisters in the region recognize the existential threat, not only to government, but to the broader citizenry of this country, and the need for unequivocal support by the people and governments in the Caribbean states. We have helped in times of need. You remember Grenada in 1983, one could recall Haiti. And I want to go back to Mr. Paris's question. We, in Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados, and Jamaica, under Burnham, Barrow, Williams, and Manley, were the leaders in removing the isolation of Cuba, which I have never forgotten Guyana's leadership role. And I'm confident that Guyana, if the approach is made, and we must, I believe, a stronger diplomatic effort must be made to engage Cuba, because they can influence, I believe, some toning down of that kind of aggressive action or aggressive rhetoric which we see exhibited today. So I am an optimist, and I believe that we can rise to this opportunity to come together as a people, because in spite of our differences, we have a country that is threatened by a hostile neighbor, a bully, and that this can't be a partisan kind of approach. And I agree wholeheartedly in that the optics of exclusion are not in keeping with what should be the reality at this time. So my concluding remark would be that we must all recognize the need for total engagement. I believe that Guyana became complacent. I remember as a youth when this thing began, when Mr. Burnham and the Directorate introduced the concept of every citizen a soldier and sensitized this community or this country and its citizenry on a daily basis almost. When we listened to Another Great Blade of Grass, it was never replaced with Do We or Want with We, which seems to be the case now. We have to have a return to that as a people. And I think it's for us to recognize this threat, recognize the need, remove that level of complacency, which I saw over the, I would say, between the early 1990s and 27, just before the advent of the AP and UFC administration, a level of complacency. Nothing happened. You know, there was no aggressive action to sensitize the people, to ensure that in the curriculum was returned the national policy, to understand where we are as a people in relation to that claim, spurious claim. And I remember it was the government of Mr. Granger, APNU AFC, that moved this issue to the United Nations and ensured that it went to the ICJ based on one of the parts of the menu of measures which could be taken by the Secretary General. So I believe that we have to continue to play a role. We have to continue to be part of that. I think we have shown that we are people who can lead in this process, and we must continue to lead. Articulate your concerns, I believe, which is important, but ensure that we remain united, understanding that this is not a country of one. This is one people, one nation, and one destiny. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, starting off, one people, one nation, one destiny, national motto. I agree 100%. There was a question on why Nicaragua is supporting Venezuela. I would say that I think Nicaragua is supporting Venezuela because they see some ideological similarity between how they're thinking. They're both socialist nations, socialist countries, socialist-led governments. And that is one of the challenges also within Latin America. A number of the governments are socialist, and because Venezuela is a socialist, I think they feel a sense of commitment to Venezuela in that sense. Therefore, Guyana's diplomacy must be so active diplomacy to ensure we can defeat that. So I think that's one of the reasons. In relation to the Defense Force, I want to commend rather the distinguished lady who raised those questions and made those comments. She's well informed about the issues in Guyana, and the people you talk to, you obviously inform them of a lot of things that are happening. If a soldier is promised a house lot, or the soldiers, again, Defense Force are promised house lots, those are promises being made to citizens of Guyana. They're entitled to it. So whatever happens, if at any point in time we are engaged and there's loss of life, then it goes to the rest state. And if there's no engagement, it goes to them. Because I like to say that people do not tend to value the work of those of us who prevent conflict. It's not only those who get injured or die in conflict are heroes. Those who prevent the conflict in the first place are heroes. And we've prevented conflict for the last 60 years as a nation with Venezuela. At great cost, I must admit. So yes, it's a very good question. There's a lot to be said about the military, as you said, doing sanitation work and the image it presents. And I think the military itself, if I were to speak honestly, will say that's really not my duty. One can understand now and again you're coming out in full support of a crisis, but not as a routine. So to that extent, yes, I think you have a good point. Issue of CARICOM, Dr. Curtin spoke in it. CARICOM headquarters is located in Guyana. The headquarters is located in Guyana, and that was done based on the vision of the late Forbes Burnham, recognizing that CARICOM could be fragmented from time to time. It was negotiated at the headquarters based in Guyana. So we are CARICOM to a large extent. That is really headquarters, and I agree, Dr. Curtin, that we should seek to ensure that we become the leaders in CARICOM, to keep CARICOM going. We cannot do it alone. CARICOM represents 15 votes in the United Nations. And if Guyana could get CARICOM to see a regional approach to solutions, regional approach to solutionize problems within the region, then we have 15 votes on our side. A question was asked about Venezuelan refugees. I speak in my personal capacity here. I'm on record as saying that we need to have an amnesty. First of all, announce an amnesty and ask all the Venezuelan nationals to come to that amnesty. So we separate those who have Guyanese parentage, because they're entitled to documentation, from those who are refugees who are not entitled to documentations. They're entitled to be treated under the IOM, under the Refugee Convention, with certain rights, the right to work, but not the right to vote. And those who qualify to be economic migrants. And those economic migrants themselves have a right to work, but they don't have an automatic right to vote. That has not been taken up by the government of Guyana. That is still languishing, but that is a proposal to deal with the Venezuelan nationals in Guyana, which provides some comfort to all our people that we know who they are, where they are, and particular rights they have. The question on protocol on reporting, the protocol on reporting and military. Yes, there ought to be a protocol, and there is a protocol. To answer Kwebe's question, I believe what was required, in my view, with that visit by the President acting as the commander-in-chief, is that the troops in a combat deployment mode is what would provide a resonance of representation by the Guyana Defense Force in relation to this issue. So the fact that the picture shows the president with the troops in sort of like a casual mode. The pictures we see of Venezuela on the other side are in combat mode. So what we need is pictures in combat mode, from a distance, in combat mode, showing the readiness of the Guyana Defense Force. At some point in time, you have to rest. But it looked as though it was a photo op to me, a photo opportunity, and not really a sense of seriousness. And what it does to the Guyana Defense Force is create this image as though the Guyana Defense Force is in relaxed mode also on the borders. So it really does an injustice to the Guyana Defense Force, and there's a lack of sensitivity and sensibility to this issue coming straight from the president as the head of state. So I think they should relook and rethink it and ensure that when you display the Guyana Defense Force on the borders which they are located on, they've been there for decades, we have to show them in combat mode and combat readiness right now to deal with this situation if it comes to that point. So I think it's a good question, and the government should take heed about that. Additionally, let me mention that there is some events on December 3rd, one of which was a national fete at the stadium. It's now changed to National Patriotic something, but it is still at the National Stadium. December 3rd, in my view, should be National Alert Day. Every Guyanese should be on alert. There should be no congregation of 5,000 people in the National Stadium. Are we giving the Venezuelans a human target? I find it inconceivable that we'll have a national event at the stadium on December 3rd. It should be a National Alert Day where we're all on alert in this country in support of each other. So even though it is changed to a national something else, because we're going to have thousands of people in the stadium, that is a soft target for the Venezuelans. At the same time, when the relatives and children and brothers and sisters of those persons are on the borders defending Guyana, I think it's a miscalculation by the government, and it should not be. It should not go through. And I hope there's sufficient activism against that. My final point, perhaps, would be I agree with the person who raised the question about respect for women. It was a vicious attack against MP Cathy Hughes, and there have been a lot of calls since then for an unqualified, I would say, apology from, in this case, I would say the Vice President of the Guyana. The Vice President and Cathy Hughes are two elected officials. None is more important than the other. They are elected officials in this country, and each of them deserve due respect. And it is shameful on the part of the PPP to not, at this point in time, based on all my social media checks, have not issued a statement yet in condemnation of this particular activity. How can you refer to somebody as a lowlife? It is repugnant. It is repugnant. And it's a dark day in the history of this country. And when we talk about unity in effort going forward, that is disunity being practiced, perhaps deliberately so. So it is good and important to call that out. I will close by saying, my closing remarks here is that only a national referendum, only a national elections can change the borders of Guyana. And if nothing else you take away, and that's the only thing you say from this symposium, I think you'll do justice to Guyana by saying our borders cannot change only by a national referendum. I thank you very much.
Pleasant good night, Mr. Chair.
Hold a second. The one question, Mr. Benjamin is ceding his time of response, but the question has to be quips.
Thank you, Mr. Benjamin.
Or I didn't have to intervene.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benjamin. A pleasant good night to the panel. This is a wonderful gesture from the Burnham Foundation My question to Mr. Best, was the government at any time invited you to any think tank group on these matters? One, as a military officer, have you ever envisioned that the Venezuelan military, the Venezuelan government, they're going to this referendum on the 3rd of December? In my opinion, this referendum will go through. Have you ever at any time, envisioned that the Venezuelan government might definitely send, let us say, 500 million people from the 28 million to occupy the Essequibo region? And what can we do as citizens? What would be your recommendation, for us, the citizens of Guyana, with a situation like that? How should we deal with an eventuality like that?
Thank you.
Well, quickly, the answer to your first question is no. I was never invited to any think tank or any discussion on this issue of the Guyana Venezuela controversy, particularly it relates to the defense of Guyana. The answer to your second question, whether I envisage it, I think if a president is threatening to annex a country, then it's equally important in that calculation to conclude there's a likelihood that troops will cross the border. So yes, I envision the possibility of it happening, and hence we are saying here and many other fora what the government of Guyana should be doing to prevent it from happening. And that's why we talk about defense diplomacy, getting international friends, getting allies to come on our side, getting statements from many organizations that will give Venezuela pause to cause, right? Cause for pause. So yes, I can envision it because of what they're saying. I can also envisage, and I'm sure you can, that if people are coming over in Venezuela at a time when they're threatening to annex Guyana, then we have to assume that in that number of persons, there are agents coming from Venezuela. If anyone should say to any Guyanese that that is an impossibility, that person is not a Guyanese. So we have to assume those things are happening. And finally, what do we do to prevent it? I thought I mentioned it just now. We need to call it the government to get every Venezuelan national under an amnesty to report to different centers across this country so we can know who are Guyanese of Guyanese parentage, who are refugees, so we can document them and give them a status, and who qualify to be migrants. And when you finish with that, those who don't qualify for any of the three categories, then we have to send them back to Venezuela. That will be the final point. So I will yield now to Mr. Benjamin.
Mr. Benjamin yield his time to the last question. Colleagues, friends, comrades, I think we've had a very good interaction, but we need to leave here with our voices being collectively heard. And in that regard, I'm going to ask one of our colleagues, Mr. Lucas, to present to us a resolution that can be the output of this evening's symposium. Mr. Lucas.
Good evening, everyone, and let me start by expressing my own gratitude to the panelists for sharing what I would consider to be some very significant and substantive views about this controversy that we have with Venezuela that keeps raising its head, its ugly head from time to time. I think they shared with us some very important information, and in my view, this education session reminded me at least that this controversy is one that we must be taking very seriously. We got not only the history, but we also got the risk to our sovereignty and territorial integrity from the panelists. We were also given certain assurances with respect to the protections that exist within our Constitution and the various legal documents relating to our territorial integrity. Now, the questions that were posed by many of you and the answers that were given have provided me with some guidance and thoughts with respect to ideas which could be part of our resolution here tonight. But before I say that, I just want to emphasize something that Dr. Best said about the event that is planned for the National Stadium. It seems as if we have forgotten what happened in Israel a couple weeks ago when they had a concert and they got a surprise attack from an enemy. And it is shocking that we don't seem to believe that a similar thing could happen to us if we drop our guard. But nonetheless, I think, as I said, the circumstances tonight allow us to leave here with our own offerings to the people of Guyana and also to the government of Guyana. And so the draft resolution which I have prepared based on all that have been said starts as follows. The participants in the Symposium on the Guyana Venezuela border controversy of November 24, 2023, sponsored by the Forbes Burnham Foundation, recalling efforts to establish the boundary between the colony of British Guyana and Venezuela, and the latter's several requests to the government of the United States of America for help in facilitating an arbitration process, noting that the United States eventually responded favorably to Venezuela's request, and a treaty of arbitration was signed between the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Venezuela in Washington on February the 2nd, 1897, to set up an arbitral tribunal to establish the boundary between the colony of British Guyana and the United States of Venezuela. Noting further that both Great Britain and Venezuela agreed to the terms and conditions of the tribunal, and specifically to Article 13 thereof, that they will consider the result of the proceeds of the tribunal of arbitration as a full, perfect, and final settlement of all the questions referred to the arbitrators. Observing that Venezuela accepted the arbitral award of 1899 without protest and joined Great Britain in a boundary commission between 1901 and 1905 to demarcate the boundaries defined by the arbitral award, further observing that Venezuela signed a joint report attesting to the correctness of the marked boundaries, and the international community accepted the demarcated boundaries as the frontier of the two countries, noting that 60 years later, Venezuela rejected the arbitral award and declared it null and void based on a spurious claim revealed after the death of a junior lawyer on the team that represented Venezuela in the arbitral award, acknowledging that Guyana inherited this spurious claim from Great Britain at independence and had since requested Venezuela to prove the nullity of the award, acknowledging further that an accord reached in Geneva, Switzerland on 17 February 1966 between Great Britain and Venezuela set out several means by which Guyana and Venezuela could seek to settle the spurious claim that Venezuela had raised, and that the Secretary General of the United Nations could be approached to decide on a mechanism of settlement, noting that several attempts under the auspices of the Secretary General of the United Nations failed to bring about a resolution of the controversy, and that at the request of Guyana, he referred the matter to the International Court of Justice for a final resolution, recognizing further that the International Court of Justice has jurisdiction to resolve the controversy, and both Guyana and Venezuela are obliged to honor the judicial ruling of the ICJ in accordance with Article 59 of the Statute of the ICJ, concerned about the decision of Venezuela to hold a referendum on December 3, 2023, with the intention of obtaining the permission of its citizens to annex the county of Essequibo of Guyana in violation of international law and with disregard for the future decision of the International Court of Justice. Further concerned about Venezuela's provocative military and political actions designed to give effect to its intention to seize the county of Essequibo based on a spurious claim and in violation of international law, be it resolved that the participants in the Symposium on the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy of November 24, 2023, sponsored by the Forbes Burnham Foundation, affirms the unified position of Guyana on the preservation of the territorial integrity of Guyana and the use of the International Court of Justice as the way that the controversy with Venezuela should be resolved. Guyana remains committed to maintaining peaceful and friendly relations with Venezuela. The actions of Guyana in seeking a peaceful settlement of the controversy are in keeping with Article 33 of the Charter of the United Nations. It's also in conformity with Article 4.2 of the Geneva Accord and Article 37 of the Guyana Constitution. The participants in the Symposium on the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy of November 24, 2023, sponsored by the Forbes Burnham Foundation, condemn Venezuela's violation of Article 5, subparagraph 2 of the Geneva Accord with its attempt to use a provocative referendum to create rights of sovereignty over Guyana's territory. Considering how effective defensive diplomacy has been in thwarting the impact of Venezuela's aggression towards Guyana, the participants in the Symposium on the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy of November 24, 2023, sponsored by the Forbes Burnham Foundation, calls on the government of Guyana to heighten its diplomatic activism, supported by a strong professional foreign service in defense of Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And finally, the Symposium on the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy of November 24, 2023, sponsored by the Forbes Burnham Foundation, proposes that the government of Guyana call for an urgent summit of the heads of government of the Caribbean community to reaffirm support for Guyana's efforts to reach a peaceful settlement of the controversy and to activate the regional security system in defense of Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity, considering Venezuela's sudden deviation from the provisions of Article 5, subparagraph 2 of the Geneva Agreement. Therein, our colleagues, is the resolution which we put before you and this nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. it's a heavy resolution at a late hour. And therefore, I'll simply ask the forum by acclamation to approve of that resolution. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Peters.
Just one element there, well, two elements. One is that I think inscribed in that should be the clause that was suggested to have the period of amnesty. I didn't think I hear that coming up in there.
The clause to what?
Have the amnesty. Our request to have the amnesty for the Venezuelans was presented a little earlier. And the second point is in the document there, where we first referred to British Guyana and then we said Venezuela, I think it might be more appropriate at that time at that stage, to indicate the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, and then subsequently, when it would have changed and Guyana became independent, then to have it as just stated. Thank you. Those are the only two parts I want to ask.
The second one is, doesn't change anything significantly. It's just, what was the historical time? Were there already the Bulgarian? We'll check that for historic correctness. Or we'll double check that one for historical correctness. The question of the amnesty, Dr. Best is suggesting that whilst the matter has been raised, he doesn't think that that's one that's necessary for the resolution. Because that does not deal directly with the border controversy. That deals with a wider situation we face with. And in itself is not a part of the resolution of the border controversy. Colleagues?
Shouldn't we say something about emphasizing education on this story, this issue?
Emphasizing?
Education, government, education.
Or public education. It's suggested we include something about the need for more public education. Noted. I think we've reached what is normally referred to as the witching hour. And in that circumstance, with your concurrence, I'd like to bring this symposium to an appropriate end with a vote of thanks by the Deputy Chairperson of the Burnham Foundation, Kibwe Copeland.
Thank you very much, Carmen Alexander. Good night again, all. As we bring the curtains down on this symposium, which I believe was very informative, very educative, and very interactive. I'll first like to give thanks to our presenters who was eloquent and very informative to our audience. Mr. Dwayne Benjamin, who gave us the historical facts on this border controversy. He took us really deep into history. Dr. Mark Curtin, who centered his presentation around the geopolitics and the need for us to look at our diplomacy and how we should put that to the forefront. Dr. Retired Rear Admiral Best, who also touched a bit on our diplomacy, but more basically on the laws, taking us into different sections of the Act and the Constitution, showing us how impossible it is to change our borders without going to a national referendum, which is only could be done at national elections. We want to give them great thanks for their presentations. We think it was well done and it did much justice in a time like now, whereby this is a heated discussion, not only in Georgetown, but across this country. I'd like to, of course, give thanks to our chairman of the Burnham Foundation, Vincent Alexander, who would have spearheaded and chaired this event. I believe his contributions as well has added to the discussion and bared, of course, much fruit. We'd like to also thank Mr. Raw Lucas, who would have pioneered when it comes to giving the resolution after our lively discussions. But more than that, I'd like to thank you, our audience, who came out this evening to listen, to participate in discussion, to pose questions, and also comments. And for those who are watching online via Facebook, YouTube, etc., I'd like to thank you as well for your participation at this symposium that deals with the Guyana Venezuela border controversy. This is one of many symposiums and more to come as we continue to keep our people educated on this the Guyana-Venezuela border controversy, as we as people, as was mentioned by Dr. Bess, all have an obligation towards the protection of our sovereignty. At this time, as I continue to thank all who are present, I thank the media personnel who are here, also those who would have given us technical support, and of course, St. Stanislaus for giving us the opportunity to utilize their auditorium. I'd like to thank all and say good night as we close the curtains and end with a uniting song, Not a Blade of Grass.